Londres.
100 years ago, young men were coming from every corner of the world to take up arms for a country on which in most cases they'd never set eyes. Hundreds of thousands, millions of volunteers came from every corner of the British Empire and Commonwealth to defend our values against the enemy. The numbers are just mind-boggling. I mean, they came from everywhere. There was, for example, we're at the moment celebrating the centenary of the West Indian Regiment, which was formed at Seaford in my constituency, which saw action in Palestine, in Mesopotamia, and in Europe. But the sheer quantity of people is staggering. 1 million volunteers just from British India. All of them volunteers. Every man had taken an individual decision to enlist. 2.5 million, by the way, in the Second World War from what is now Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. The largest volunteer army in the history of warfare. And we now find that the relatives of those volunteers, children and grandchildren of those men who came when we most needed help, are institutionally discriminated against by our immigration rules as a result of our membership of the European Union. I am not afraid to say that we owe a debt of gratitude to old friends and allies on more distant continents. There is something profoundly wrong with the idea that Britons of Commonwealth origin are not able to bring Auntie over for a wedding when she has no intention of staying in the UK because of the ludicrous hoops that we now make people go through in the visa and immigration regime, and that we do this in order to free up space for people with no connection to the UK to be able to walk in as if they had British nationality simply because they hold EU passports. That cannot be right or just, and nobody from first principles would have invented an immigration system which obliges us in practice to keep out the Indian computer programmer, the brain surgeon from New Zealand, in order to free up unlimited space for unqualified workers from the rest of the EU. Quite apart from discrimination in the field of immigration, we are also discriminating against our old friends and allies in the rest of the English-speaking world in the field of trade. We have no free trade agreement with any of the countries in the Indian subcontinent, nor with Australia, nor New Zealand, nor most of the English-speaking African states, or the states in the Caribbean. Why? Because on the 1st of January 1973, we contracted out our trade policy to the EU, and we now in practice have a much more protectionist trade policy than we would otherwise have, which particularly discriminates against the exports that these countries most depend on. Above all, agrarian and commodity exports and textiles. Britain has no particular issue with importing cheap textiles from Pakistan or India, but because there are manufacturers elsewhere in the EU who don't want the competition, we're not able to sign those free trade agreements. Now that is a basic unfairness and a basic discrimination, I'll say this again, against people on whom we depended when it really mattered. The case against the EU is not nostalgic or insular or parochial. On the contrary, we want to raise our eyes and rediscover those older alliances that sustained us down the ages. Those of us who want to leave the EU look forward to a fair deal with the Commonwealth as part of a new settlement based around a global Britain, prosperous, independent, and free.